How can we prepare during a wait time for our future dreams? That's the question we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Flourish-Meant is sponsored by Access More. Today, I have a beautiful young woman with me. Her name is Cally Logan. She's the author of two books, Dear Future Husband, A Love Letter Journey While Waiting for God's Best, and Hang in There, Girl. She's a senior writer for crosswalk.com and a 12th grade U.S. history teacher, in addition to serving as a mentor to several young women. She is from the Virginia area, and I'm so glad that she's here on Flourish-Meant today. Welcome, Cally.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on.
So tell us what kind of brought you on this journey to start writing these letters like you did in your book, Dear Future Husband. What was it like when you were in that waiting space, and what kind of prompted your heart to start preparing well for the dreams that God has for you in your life?
It's kind of a cool story because I actually started these letters 12 years ago when I was 18. I'm 30 now. And at the time, my life was just changing so quickly. I was about to graduate high school and, all the fun things that go along with that and that big new chapter in life. And I really just began to consider that one day I did have that desire to get married, and I really began to pray about it more. And I felt that God was really watering that seed of desire that He had placed in my heart. And I considered that it was very clear I didn't know my husband at the time, but I wanted to share some of the ever changing things in my world with him. And so I kind of wanted to do like a message in a bottle to him. And so I started my own personal letters. And then it actually ended up becoming a book, which is really cool. But it's a little less autobiography and it's a little more open to just concepts and growth things that any woman could relate to.
That is so important to keep it relevant to people that are paying attention to this, listening to this. It's not just a memoir, it's something that they can take in their hands and make practical. So, for you on your journey, what was the most practical thing for you to do regarding your mindset when you were in that waiting time?
Yeah, I actually still am in that waiting time. But I think one of the biggest things is just focus on God because He holds the timeline of my life, of your life, of everyone's lives. And so realizing that I'm not late and I'm not too early, I'm right on time for what He wants as long as my eyes are set on Him. And I think that was one of the biggest revelations through writing the letters, through this whole journey in waiting, and even just the creation of this book, just seeing how God is so in every intricate detail. He holds all of it in His hands.
So, trusting God with every moment is kind of where you're talking about that mindset of waiting on God, not just waiting on the fulfillment of something you want.
Exactly. And it's developing that rapport with God, that relationship with God, that intimate relationship with God. Because whomever comes into your life, be it a spouse, be it a best friend, be it all in one, God should always be our first love. And that relationship with God should always be our best and most fulfilling and healthiest relationship of every relationship we have. So that was a really big thing that I learned over the past 12 years as well in that waiting period, that that's not going to change. God will always be number one, whomever He brings in, into my life. He will always have that first spot.
That's so healthy because when we put all of our heart and all of our hopes into a specific outcome, into a gift that God gives us that He may or may not give us the way we expect it, we can get easily disappointed. Can you talk about really managing your expectations so that you're not setting yourself up for disappointment?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that has become clear, even in the past year, was really dwelling upon Psalm 37:4. It says, if you delight yourself in the Lord, He will give you the desires of your heart. And so, thinking about the desires of our heart and where did those come from? Are those things that we are coming up with, or are those seeds that God has planted? And the answer to that is when we delight ourselves in Him. Because when we're finding our full fulfillment in God, when we are placing our will and our heart, our mind, and our lives before Him at His throne and saying, God, as much as I can imagine, and I have a great imagination, I know you have your best for me. And your best is always going to exceed the greatest idea I could ever come up with for my best. You're really handing that over to him, handing that pen over to him, and allowing him to flourish that and to grow that. And so you know that if he has you in that time period, you might have, those it's normal to be disappointed. I certainly thought I'd be married by 30. I thought I'd have some kids by 30. And when I passed my birthday this year, I did have some disappointment, but instead of dwelling upon that, I did allow myself to have those moments of grief. But I also looked at it and thought, well, I trust God more, and I know He's not forgotten. I know this isn't a no, it's just a not yet. And when He does bring those things forward, it's going to be all the more marvelous. So I think really just placing those things before Him and even giving Him our disappointments, even coming before Him humbly saying, Lord, I thought this would look different. I thought this would be different, but I am going to trust you because you do know what's correct. And just thinking about what Jesus said in John 13:7, you may not understand what I'm doing now, but one day you will. And like to look at that with curiosity. Like, well, it's not the way I would have written it, but I'm so curious what he's up to because I know one day I'll look back in retrospect and I would say God knew what was best. He did what was correct in that time period. And I'm glad he wrote it the way he did. And he didn't give me what I wanted instantly when I wanted it.
There's such a deep maturity of faith in it, with all those things that you're saying about trusting God's timeline instead of making a plan and an agenda and a schedule by which we want these things done. That God has told us He may have promised us to do these things. These may be things that we really feel like we have prayed about and God has said yes on. And yet we're not seeing the outcomes by the time that we set. Then instead, you're saying, trust God with that timeline, trust God
Mhm.
with that schedule. We may not know all the reasons why He has the timeline laid out the way that He
Yeah.
does, but can we trust that He knows it better than we do? That's kind of the issue at the core, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And one of my friends put it this way recently, and I really loved it. He said, when you plant a seed and you allow God to water it, there's a lot of time that seed spends under the dirt before you even see that little sprout. And so there's a lot of time just waiting and waiting and waiting with expectation. And if you're trusting God, you're trusting the gardener, that seed will sprout and you will see that. But you have to wait while it's doing that work underneath the ground too.
And I'm thinking about Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament. They
Yeah.
waited way longer for the promise of God. And in their case, it was for a child. And
Hmm.
they tried to make it happen on their own. And that had terrible consequences. Can you talk about recognizing the truth of, discerning between doing it on our own and making it happen and what God really wants us to do and how He wants us to wait on Him sometimes instead?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent story to bring up because you look at that where they did take it into their own hands, but they were not powerful enough to thwart the plan of the Lord. They did have consequence and they did take things, and you can't help but wonder if maybe it prolonged and delayed what the promise was to come into fulfillment, but they couldn't thwart the absolute specific detailed promise that God gave. He didn't give a promise with an asterisk and saying, well, it'll be Abraham's son, but not Sarah's, or it will be, an adopted son by Sarah, not at all. He promised a son to them. And so I think when we look at that in our own lives, we really have to write it down specifically if we feel that God has given us a promise and we've prayed through it and we've made sure it aligns with scripture and everything else, looking at that and placing that before Him for Him to fulfill that in His timing and in His way. But I think we also have to look at it that we have to let Him have His way. We can't call the shots. We have to just take that next step of obedience and whatever that looks like. And a lot of times that obedience is just being willing to say, okay, it's not today, and that's all right. But what am I doing in the meantime? What am I growing in the meantime? What is God growing in me? And that's surrender, not just sitting there watching paint dry, but allowing Him to do those things and you as well. There's a lot of, I think, heart refinement work that happens in that time too.
That's an important point because I can see in you this maturity that has developed out of you waiting well. There's a difference between waiting impatiently and waiting well. And I think that you have chosen to intentionally trust God and put Him first instead of putting the blessings ahead of God and worshiping the blessings and making that your source of happiness. So, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I haven't always waited well. I want to put that out there. I think in my own, specific journey, and I try to, really open up about that in the book too, so that other women who are feeling that pain, that ache. I think it's really an ache of loneliness and of waiting can relate to it as well. Um, but I think I realized a few years ago that I had kind of made getting married almost an idol, and an idol isn't just this little, bronze calf that is made, or gold calf. It's whatever we're putting between God and us. It's that middle thing. And I think for a little while I realized I was putting his promise as an idol between he and I. And I actually had a loving friend kind of call me out on it. And she said, I know that this is a heart desire of yours. And I know that there's not anything inherently sinful. You don't want to be married because you want some selfish gain, but I do think it's prohibiting you from growing more in God. And so I think you need to kind of put it to the side and just focus on Christ. And it rubbed me the wrong way at first, but then I calmed myself and my own flesh down, and I realized, yeah, I have made it an idol, and I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want that promise to be the end all be all, because it's not. God is the end all be all. So I think just making sure that our hearts are in the right place, and our heart stature and our focus too, and just watching out for those little foxes, those things that will seek to eat away at us or seek to distract us, or anything can become an idol if we let it.
So we need to do a daily heart check to make
Hmm.
sure that God is first. And that would be one way to make sure that you are not making an idol out of the dreams and the blessings and the gifts that God has for us, that we're
Yeah,
keeping God first. So that's really important. I want to get
yeah,
into some more practical things in the second half of our conversation. But for now, I do want you to have an opportunity to share where people can find you and stay connected with you and also get copies of your books.
yeah. Everything is on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all at christianbook.com. And then you guys can check me out on my website. I hang out on Instagram a whole lot. That's where I do a lot of things. So I'm Callie with a Y. It's a little different spelling, so sometimes people will spell it wrong. But yeah, Callie at Cally Logan for everything, for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and CallyLogan.com. I do devotionals and stuff like that every month, and try to stay connected. And I have some fun merch on there too.
I hope that all of you listening were inspired and encouraged by this wonderful conversation and the tips that we shared from Cally Logan's book, Dear Future Husband. And of course, I also hope that you come back for the next episode of Flourishment. Flourishment is part of the Spark Media Network and can be found on the Edify app.